Hey everyone, welcome to Coral Currents.
So we have Dr. Emma Camp here today. Little rundown on her resume. She is the team leader of the Future Reefs team, co-founder of the Coral Nurture program on the Great Barrier Reef, and she holds an honorary position with the United Nations as part of the second class of young leaders for the Sustainable Development Goals. In 2020, she was named inaugural Australian Academy of Sciences STEM Women's Game Changer and Max Day Environmental Science Fellowship Award. Made Time Magazine's 2020 Next Generation Leaders list. Dr. Emma Camp is a National Geographic Explorer and L'Oreal UNESCO Woman in Science Fellow Rolex Award for Enterprise Laureate. So I'm so honored to have this person here. I've followed you for so long. You're like a rock star in the coral world. So I'm trying not to be a fangirl here, but I am totally fangirling. I have read several of your research papers now, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. So in regards to supercorals, ranges of coral environments, SSTs, policy, what's something you think we should focus on for this conversation, or at least just to kick it off?
Yeah, look, great question. And thank you for the very humbling introduction. Great to be here and speaking with you today. Look, I think, a good place to start is just why do we care about reefs? Like what is so valuable about reefs that we should even be talking about them or studying them when there's so many other problems and environments that need our interest? So maybe that's a good place for us to kick off.
Yeah, perfect. That sounds like a great place to start. And for you, Emma, as someone who's working hands-on with one of the world's largest, most iconic protected areas, the Great Barrier Reef, could you give us a brief rundown on why coral reefs are so vital, not just to marine ecosystems, but to us as people? Maybe you can share some of your insights on what's happening with the reef right now, especially the challenges you're seeing and addressing in your work, perhaps with the Coral Nurture program.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a good place. So I guess if we think about coral reefs, they cover less than 1% of the ocean floor, but house over 25% of marine life. So most things in the ocean spend some time, adjacent to or on a coral reef. But then coral reefs also often found adjacent to many island or even non-island communities and play a really important role to buffer wave activity, to slow sea level rise and to reduce coastal erosion. Then you add in the fact that there's cultural significance, they support things like tourism. So actually 1 billion people fundamentally rely on coral reefs for some part of their everyday livelihood.
Wow. Quick comment on that. 1 billion people rely on these vital coral ecosystems. That's incredible.
So when we think about coral reefs and we think about the fact that they're being lost globally, we're seeing a global loss of coral. It's not just the fish and the marine life that are at risk, it's society as a whole, because they are such fundamental ecosystems to many people around the world. So I guess bringing that back then to Coral Nurture program was that here in Australia, we have the Great Barrier Reef. It's a national icon. You can see it from space. It's amazing. But coral cover has been declining, like many reefs around the world, since the 1980s. But 2016 and 2017, we had the first back-to-back marine heat waves to occur. This impacted about 50% of the reef, and about 30% of corals died in that kind of 2-year period. So this was a pivotal moment in Australia because the Great Barrier Reef is one of the best managed marine parks in the world. It's got, amazing protection, but we were still losing coral cover. And so it was a warning sign that, even the best protected marine parks are not going to be immune to stress, and that we need to think differently about how we engage with the reef. And so this led to an increase in what we call active intervention. So scientists, communities, traditional owners actually actively engaging to try and help the reef. And so this is what led to Coral Nurture Program. So working with traditional owners, the tourism industry, to actually find high value reef sites from both an economic and an ecological perspective, and to try and find how we could grow and propagate corals guided by science to rehabilitate those reef sites. So it was a good example of where we saw the need for the science to protect the ecology and the biology, but also that we couldn't forget the communities, the fundamental people that are involved and rely on the reef to engage them in the solutions that we need to protect it.
Yeah. And I am really excited to talk about the community engagement, Indigenous people getting involved, especially in Australia. I think science is just totally improved when you get to involve those voices.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And we think here in Australia, the Indigenous communities have got, they've got the heritage, they've got the knowledge, they knew about the reef when the reef was land, they've got the stories and the song lines that we can all learn from, but also their model for caring for country has been sustainable, and sea country has been sustainable for, so many years. And actually it's, Western influences that have led to a lot of unsustainable practices that now have us where we are today. And so ensuring that we have this, truly co-designed knowledge sharing between Western and traditional science is fundamental for us to effectively manage these systems.
Absolutely. Yeah, wonderful introduction to how important corals are and what you guys are doing out there in Australia right now. Thank you so much for that. That was beautiful. So I'm wondering now, what's worse for corals? Because I think a lot of people are not sure about this. Is it rising sea temperatures or ocean acidification? Which one has, or is it chicken and the egg, know?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, the reality is that the reef's got a lot going on, and it depends kind of where you are. So for some reef sites around the world, it may be pollution from dredging or land-based practices that are actually bringing pollutants and things on. So you have these local stresses that are really specific, but the ones you mentioned are the global stresses. So with climate change, with increased fossil fuels, that oceans absorb them. And that's amazing that they do that, because if they didn't absorb those gases, it would be a lot hotter on the planet than it is now.
Okay, pretty important piece she just mentioned here. Oceans soaking up CO2. And actually, they do soak up the most CO2 out of any other system on this planet.
And that's an amazing role that the oceans play. But it comes at a cost to the ocean. So the ocean absorbs that heat and the oceans become warmer, but also it changes the fundamental chemistry. So we get ocean acidification, and we also get lower oxygen, which is another thing that we often don't think about with climate change. And so, heat is the primary one that we focus on, because we are seeing these mass heating events, these marine heat waves, where we visibly see the die off of corals very quickly. And so that's the one kind of we focus on. We've just had the 4th mass coral bleaching event globally. Over 70% of the world's coral reefs were impacted. But ocean acidification is this kind of ongoing, slow eroder. And so I kind of think of it, if you were immunocompromised, you had this underlying disease or issue that affected your ability to deal with a cold. That's kind of what your ocean acidification is. It's always there. It's making it harder for you to deal with other stresses that come, because it makes it harder for corals to build their structure, to repair. So we focus often on heat because we see the impacts a lot sooner, but ocean acidification is there and it's eroding that resilience all of the time.
Gotcha. Is this heating event something totally new to corals, or have they gone through heating events like this in the past and just managed to pull through?
Yeah, this is a great question. So we know that there have been heating events in the past. For example, there was a big one in 1998, another one in 2010. So we know that these events have happened, and looking through fossil records, there is some evidence that there could have been some, heating events in the past. But the key is that the frequency and the severity of these heating events are now beyond what we've ever seen before. And that's what's crucial, because we know that corals can be very tough, they can be very resilient, and they can recover from stress. But if we are making these annual events, then the reef doesn't have a chance to recover from the previous one. Because when we have a heating event, it's not just the corals that die during that event, but it's also the fact that the corals that survived use a lot of energy to survive. And so things like their lipid stores, so their fats basically, they get eroded, but they're really important for reproductive capacity. So we often see that after a bleaching event, many corals are not as successful as producing their sperm and eggs for reproduction.
Let's just take a quick note on how important this is. So these heating events, especially the El Nino years, don't just bleach corals, they're interrupting their reproduction cycle entirely.
So there's a double whammy, if you like, in terms of how the recovery potential of that reef, because you've got less coral and then potentially less ability of the coral to produce offspring to repopulate that reef. So that's really, from a science perspective, why we're so concerned, because these events are becoming more severe, longer in duration, and also more frequent.
Yeah, so it's like getting hit with it over and over again. Now they're less strong, so they can't recover as quickly.
Yeah.
And so how interesting, right, that this is the first time we're seeing in the entire Earth's history this kind of global heating event that certain corals, certain species do have.
So this has been an area that my team's been really interested in, is to try and say, okay, like this is happening. Are there ways that corals can adapt to these changes? And there's a few ways we can do that. We can look during a bleaching event, see who survives, try and study those individuals and say, okay, what was it about those individuals that allowed them to survive? And we can look at things like their genetics, their physiology and things like that. But that kind of doesn't give us a chance to really forecast if these events are going to become more intense and severe into the future. It doesn't give us a chance to forecast kind of how corals may fare. And so one thing that we've done is been to try and find what we call like a natural laboratory. So are there habitats where typically we don't find corals, but if we look, there are actually corals there. It's not their normal preferred habitat. But these environments can almost be a representative of what future conditions are going to look like on reefs. So one such example has been things like mangrove lagoons. They're very common around reef systems, and they often get very hot, they get very acidic, and they have low oxygen. So they have these trio of stresses that reefs are going to have to contend with. And my team's actually found, by deploying sensors, or put sensors down and they basically log the environment continuously, we can download the data, that we can see that the corals will spend periods of time in conditions more extreme than we're predicting for reefs in the year 2100. So this is an opportunity for us to say, okay, which corals have survived, if any? What has been the compromise to their fitness? So do they look different? Do they grow differently? But also, and most importantly, how have they survived that? What has been their adaptive mechanisms? And can we almost use that then for a blueprint to look for novel interventions to try and help reefs more broadly?
That is incredible. It kind of reminds me of the coral nurturing programs that happen on land, where they're physically adapting corals, but this is actually happening in nature, and you are able to observe that, which is actually quite unique, because not a lot of people are doing this right now. And it's because it's a harder thing to study, isn't it? Because you have to go into that environment quite regularly, I would think. Or at least seasonally as well, and collect this data, try to make something of it, and across several habitats too, which is quite the task that you've taken on.
Yeah. So, what's been amazing is that we've seen increased global interest in the research community to want to study these systems. So I mentioned mangroves. There are researchers that looking at, say, the hot sea in the Persian Arabian Gulf. There's people that are looking at deeper corals. There's people looking at shallow reef flats. So this is great because, that's really what we want with science, is different labs and teams doing similar but complementary research, so we can pull out common trends, so that we can say, okay, this actually seems like something that is what corals do, which has been really great. But absolutely, for our work, these natural laboratories, first of all, finding them, like actually trying to find where are these unique corals. Often they're not conveniently located, so it's somewhere that takes like a long time to get to by boat. So then it's not just time, but it's the cost as well. So then trying to make sure we can get out there, and then also working out, as you say, kind of how do we unpackage the drivers in those systems. So one of the great things about running a lab experiment is you control everything other than what you want to vary. So
exactly,
that's great. You can say, okay, I want to test the effective temperature, everything else stays the same, and you change temperature. In these systems, what makes them so unique is that lots of things co-vary and change at once. And so some ways that we try to study these corals are to actually take them and put them in a lab experiment to kind of control the situation and see how they respond. But also we do reciprocal transplantation. So we'll take some corals from these mangrove systems and put them on a reef, and then we'll take the same species of coral found on the reef and put it into the mangroves. And then we'll track those corals for a year or longer to see, are the ones from the reef able to survive into the mangroves? Do the ones in the mangroves keep their tolerance? And we found that they do. So one of the researchers in my team, Dr. Christine Roper, has had this really great study that's about to be published that shows that actually these corals have higher thermal tolerance, but that they retain that tolerance after 1 year out on the reef. And so that's really important for us to understand that actually, if we wanted to consider kind of some of these super corals in restoration programs, they could provide a source of genetic tolerance that could then help kind of the broader system for if they start reproducing to get that innate tolerance.
Okay, time for another little quarterly comment here. So what she just discussed was reciprocal transplantation of corals in coral reefs. So this is transplanting corals, taking them from one location or environment, putting them in another one, and observing how they perform in their new surroundings. So it's a technique with coral restoration, and it allows the researchers to kind of understand their genetics and the environmental factors that are influencing their growth. Then perhaps they might say, hey, you know what? This coral did really great in this other environment where the other corals are struggling. They can do a lot with that information.
So these sorts of different techniques we have to apply to try and get some answers.
Yeah, so you get to learn a lot about what corals have, these special adaptations. It is just so amazing. This is the exact type of research I've been following for a long time, trying to learn how they're studying the particular heat adaptations that coral species have. And there's a lot of complex things out there, like the protein pathways. People are still studying how coral bleaching actually works within a coral. I mean, it's such a complex process to do with, you have your algae symbiont, and then you have the coral cells, and that interaction that's happening somewhere along the way, apoptosis happens, and we just don't really know who instigated the fight there. So
indeed, still a lot to learn. And I think that's a real challenge, is that we're at a point in time where time's not on our side. The predictions for reefs are that if we hit 1.5 degrees of warming, arguably we're already there, that 70 to 90% of hard coral tropical reefs will be lost. And so we're at a point where we're having to really think about what science can do, new management strategies, trying to minimize risk in any of those strategies, whilst also knowing that if we do nothing, the reality is that we are going to lose functional reefs, at least as we know them, likely within our lifetime.
Yeah, that brings up a whole nother point. I think a lot of people, I've actually just heard this opinion recently, that scientists were just over exaggerating what the changes would be, because they said that all of the forest should be gone by now. Do you feel like we've really been over exaggerating this, or is nature actually able to survive much better than we could have possibly predicted? What do you think about that opinion?
I think it's a really important one, and it's something actually that we spoke about in my lab group recently about how do we communicate, particularly with climate deniers, about the science. And I think a really key part is acknowledging that the science, particularly when we're forecasting to the future, is model based, it's prediction based, right? So there's a level of confidence that we have. So the stats that I just gave, in that report that got together 50 of the leading, scientists around the world, and they basically have put a high confidence level on those stats. So actually understanding the confidence levels and making sure that as scientists we communicate, that there is a level of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
I think that's really crucial. I do think that we're realizing that there can be greater adaptation than we realize for individuals, and that's fantastic. But also that we're when we talk about these stats, we talk about these predictions, we're talking about everything everywhere. But actually, if you look at reefs everywhere, there are compelling evidence that we are losing reefs. The reefs are continuing to decline. The rate may be slightly different. It may be more in some areas. So in Florida, for example, there's less than 1% coral cover now at many of those sites. So the model there is probably worse than what was predicted. Whereas, say, in some other global locations, it may be slightly better. And so, again, I think as scientists and communicators, we have to be really careful to ensure that those nuances get conveyed to people. We take the Great Barrier Reef, it's over 2,000 reefs, right? So one reef could be doing actually okay because it's got lucky for whatever reason, whereas other reefs may be doing really badly. And I think it's our job to ensure that we communicate those when we talk about the reality of the situation, so that people realize, okay, some might actually be doing okay, and that's good, but the big picture is that there is this negative impact and we should be concerned. And I think the final point I would say is we only have to look now at what's happening to communities around the world. The LA fires, we had similar severe fires in Sydney a few years ago, the flooding that's been seen. These events are linked to the climate becoming more unpredictable and more unstable. And so I think that we will start seeing the impacts on humanity, and that is going to make people realize, okay, this is what people have been talking about. And it's that instability, because I hear people say, oh, we had the coolest winter that we've ever had, so climate change is real. But actually part of that stochastic variance is what is predicted to happen, that uncertainty, those extreme highs, extreme lows, and with that then knock-on effects. So yeah, I think it's fair that people, and we should acknowledge those thoughts about alarmist levels, and some predictions have been wrong in the past and some will be wrong into the future as well. But if we step back and look objectively at the collective evidence, the climate is changing very rapidly, and nature is our early warning sign. Coral reefs are often called the canary in the coal mine because they are one of the first things to signal a change in the climate. And so if we look back historically, like losses of reefs have been associated with climatic change. And so we then say, okay, we should be concerned, and we should be concerned enough for ourselves to want to do something about this.
And I like the point where you say, because it's okay, so it's a double-edged sword. Scientists should be more descriptive on what exactly is happening in regard to coral bleaching. Where is it happening? It's not just everywhere. Not all corals are dying. I think a lot of that too is, how do we manage the media? How do we change these headlines? And a lot of times scientists don't have the power to influence that, especially in the United States. We're seeing, quite literally everybody I talk to out here is like, why are you studying the corals? They're all dead. I'm like, they're not, but it makes sense. You would think that because there's not really a lot of corals here.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a problem. For me, it's been something that as I've gone on and I've been involved more in science communication, I've been a lot more decisive and upfront in the types of communication that I will personally be involved in. And I've actually found there are great media allies out there that do want to make sure the story is right. They do want to capture the nuances correctly, and actually having the confidence to say, I'd like to see, an edit of this before it goes, goes live, or if it's not live, how can I at least see a transcript? Because sometimes they're not going to show something to you. So I think
that's brilliant.
Yeah, they're the sorts of things I've been trying to do. It's not always possible, but I think the problem is you can do all of that, and then another third party or somebody else can pick that up with whatever headline that you want. And that's really difficult to counteract that. And I think, again, it's just, I think we can control our sphere of influence. And then there are things outside of our sphere of influence that unfortunately we can't control, but we can try to advocate for better, regulation and things like if you have opportunities to speak with government or depending if that's going to be beneficial or not, depending on where you are. But again, these spheres of influence, I think there is a lot we can't control, and our effort is wasted in that space. So trying to control the sphere of influence you can, and trying to counteract the negative truths that are out there. And there are a lot, unfortunately. So it's a hard time, not just for coral science, but I think science in general. It's a very challenging time. So yeah, it's something that as a community we're going to have to keep trying to tackle.
And as like a young scientist myself, trying to breach this world of coral restoration or at least coral research, I'm almost wondering what kind of advice you would have as somebody in America who is seeing these huge defunding efforts. Right now, it's not allowed to have the word climate change, climate science, all sorts of keywords that we're not allowed to put into grants currently. Do I need to take my studies outside of the country? Do I need to, this is a way that I'm able to try to connect with people, at least. But do you have any advice for young women in science or any other kind of minority group that's facing these hard times?
I've got a lot of colleagues. I've got some really great friends that are based in the US. So I'm very across the situation there. And look, I think, firstly, I think we feel it as a community. And I think that's the first thing, is realizing, you're absolutely not alone. There is a community of people that, the fundamental point of science is to objectively seek truth, to advance knowledge for humanity, right? That's what's really, hard with everything, is that asks a question, sets out to test it. Sometimes it fails, and then we learn from it, and others come after us. And so I would say, as hard as it is, it's never been a more important time to have women, minority groups, science in general, in countries where science is trying to be oppressed, because we need that truth, we need that knowledge. And ultimately, humanity and our future is going to really be shaped by how we get through this period of time and change. Again, as hard as it is, taking some solace in the fact that there is a community of people abroad, but also within countries, that are all wanting the same thing, that people aren't alone. I think actually reaching out and seeing that those connections are there, but also knowing that things can change. And I think this is something that I've seen time and time again, is that yes, there might be national policies that are making things very challenging, but actually down maybe at a state level or at a local level, there are still opportunities. There are different policies. There are opportunities that we, again, can look at. Where is our sphere of influence? Where can we do something that we can control and feel that we are making a difference? And it may not be at this level that we want, but we have to accept, okay, if everybody does that, we will see positive change. So yeah, I'm not going to have all the answers. It's definitely a really tricky time. I think that's, somewhere I start.
That's awesome. I kind of lit up a little bit, because every time I ask that, I'm just kind of like, what do you think? You can't answer. You can't have all the answers. And you're totally right. If, just like I'm doing now, if I can't be in the field directly helping corals, I'm going to talk to people that are, and to make more public knowledge, because I think that's a big issue right now, is, like I said, that mistranslation that's happening from science to media. And I appreciate that you saw this podcast and willingly came onto it knowing that it wasn't just another media headline kind of situation, you know?
I was going to just say, you just made me think of one thing, which I think is a really important point that you've made, which is that I think that there's a misconception that it doesn't matter if it's reefs or if it's rainforests, if it's lakes, rivers, that the solutions to the problems we face lie purely with science. And actually, that's never been as far from the truth. We need the science to provide the knowledge and the understanding of what's going on. We need them to come up with some ideas and solutions, but we actually need almost every discipline and field now to contribute to the solutions. We need engineering, we need design, we need communications, we need media, we need education, we need policy. And so, you know, we need like legal support. So again, if people are listening to this and thinking like, yeah, I care about, even if it's not coral reefs, I care about your local park, but you're like, oh, but I'm not a scientist. Like, that doesn't matter. And I say this, like, everyone has a superpower that they're really good at. And I say this to my students, if your superpower is not science, that's okay. You can be really passionate about reefs, but use, you know, if you're an amazing artist, use that as your way to convey your passion and your understanding and communicate to the world the threats that reefs are happening. If you're really good at communication and marketing, like, wow, like we definitely need you, because we can't communicate as scientists particularly well why we should be caring about reefs. And I always say, if Apple can convince us that we need a new iPhone, and you know, then we need like comms people like that convincing the world why we need reefs, right? So valuable.
Oh man, yeah.
Yeah, it's you know, like going back to that sphere of influence, it's definitely, it's not just a science problem. It involves all of us, and all of us can be part of the solution. So I think that's something that we can all look at to say, okay, what can I do?
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. I love to hear that. It makes me feel like I'm doing a good job here and exactly where I should be. So that's perfect. I never thought about doing a podcast either. As I started my job as a DNA manufacturer, I had 12-hour work days and a lot of in-between time when the robots are kind of just doing their job. And I took that time and I just started listening podcast after podcast and just seeing how they did it. I haven't gotten this huge following or anything. I mean, that's not even necessarily what I'm concerned with, but the only reason I would be concerned with that is because I want to reach a large number of people. I want them to hear these really important conversations that we're having. Kind of wanted to touch a little bit on a couple of your other papers. One of them titled, How Can Supercorals Facilitate Survival Under Rapid Environmental and Climate Change? I liked how the paper gave like a more concrete meaning, moving away from the vague, flashy term supercoral. Because I remember when that came out and I was like, cool, yeah. And then once the whole propaganda about GMOs came out and stuff, I was like, okay, maybe supercoral is not a good title, or, you know, somewhere along the way it got mistranslated.
No, definitely. It was, so that was an interesting one because it was sort of, we felt an obligation, I guess, to write that paper because we were basically looking at corals that had higher natural tolerance and others as well. Supervisor at the time.
So you guys actually, so you were the first one to kind of term supercoral.
So we were, there was actually Madeline Van Oppen and Ruth Gates. They had some work previously and they talked about supercoral. So we were involved, definitely not one of the first. But we were sort of, when it started to build momentum, we were one of the first groups that kind of had the word associated with the work that we were doing. And so, yeah, my boss at the time, Professor David Suggett, and I, we were talking and we're like, oh, it's not very sciencey. Like, what are you super to? How long are you super? What's the risk of being super? And actually, how do you know that like the coral is super versus the environment actually is just providing a refuge. So actually the coral itself is not super tolerant. It just lives in an environment that helps it survive through stress. And so we kind of felt this obligation to say, look, like this term has a purpose to play, and it's fine if we say something's got super tolerance or it's a super coral, but as a scientific community we need to self-regulate and actually make sure that we're saying, okay, well, what do we mean by that? Like, do we mean that you're tolerant to a temperature of 1 degree? Because if we're predicting that corals are going to have to, say, deal with multiple degrees of warming, it doesn't matter if the coral's tolerant to 1 degree if it's can't survive the future, or if it's tolerant to temperature but really susceptible to disease. It's also not that helpful. And there's obviously then consequences for management decisions on how we would use these corals that needs us to think about that broader picture. And so we kind of came up with a framework to just say, like, fine to use this, but like, let's make sure we're clarifying what we're calling super. Do we know how long it would be super for? What are the trade-offs of being super? And are we really sure that it's the individual, the coral itself, or actually is the environment playing a role? And you know, some of the reason for wanting to do that paper was from criticism within the scientific community that we got. And I think that's a really important role that we play as scientists to each other. And I think often people outside science don't realize is that science to science, you know, we can be very critical. Scientists, we peer review papers. When a paper gets published, we don't just write it and it goes out into the world. Other scientists read it, they evaluate it. They're often very critical on things. We have to collect more data. We have to respond to that. We have to edit our writing. And so there's this, what we call peer review process that's overseen by an editor at a journal to ensure that self-regulation. And I think that's what gives science its credibility, and something that, again, we could do a better job of communicating is that we don't always agree within the community, and that's also okay. And that self-regulation is critical.
It is not just a paper that is written and then that's it, you know, well, there's all the funding is just, you know, this text right here. I think a lot of people might not realize too, especially if they haven't done scientific writing, is that it's built upon from all of the people before you. And, you know, and the reason for that is so that you can follow that framework that people are trying to build. It's like a building. And it doesn't stand without that previous research, and it won't stand without somebody picking it up, which is why it's so beautiful to have, you know, someone like you creating such influential work with your team, because otherwise, who knows where it would have turned, you know?
No, it's such an important piece, and yeah, I love that analogy, because it really is, you are building on others. And, you know, it's very rare that something is going to be like a world first or like the first discovery. Like, it may be, but like if you really step back, there was something, you know, there were things that led to that discovery, or there were things that led to that thought process. And that's, for me, it's one of the things that's so amazing about science. And also, maybe that's also something back to your earlier question of like feeling, you know, what can we do in this period? And actually, we don't have to solve everything ourselves. We have to just help move the pendulum forward and do what we can. And as a community, then we'll get close. And as a community, then we'll get closer to the, you know, the outcomes and the goals that we desire.
Oh man, yeah. This I'm just so happy because this episode has really taken a direction I guess I wasn't even expecting, you know. I was here just ready to drill you with questions on the papers, but we've gone a little conceptual here, and it's perfect because I think that you really do get conceptual with your papers a lot, which I appreciate. It's not just the hard science. It's something that people can just read through. Another big reason I wanted to have this podcast, I know I keep reiterating that, but not a lot of people know how to read a research paper, or even can, because it gets so wordy. with every science, you have to learn a new language. So
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, so I really like the way that you word your papers. Let's do a jump to another paper that she's authored on: coral reef protection is fundamental to human rights. I pulled a particular quote saying, petitions to date have typically been led by women groups, youth, local communities, and indigenous peoples. Inequity of climate change. I commented and I said, those who are most affected are struggling because of the type of climate effects that they're facing are primarily the ones left to battle it. So what do you see the issue with this being?
Yeah. So we go back to, I guess, the start of the podcast, and we talk about 1 million people, 1 billion people relying on coral reefs, and that many of those are in the poorest or, least able to do something about their situation. And so this came about where I was actually asked to write a book chapter, and that just got published. And it was talking about the roles and risks of microbial interventions for coral restoration. I'm not an ethicist. One thing to be a good scientist is to know what you do know and what you don't know. So I was like, okay, I can comment on the science aspects here. But in terms of like legal frameworks and ethics, like that's not my forte. So reached out to a colleague at the University of Technology, Sydney, Dr. Genevieve Wilkson, and she's, a fantastic human rights lawyer and really understood kind of these nuances around ethics and legality, but she hadn't ever applied it to coral reefs before. And so we got talking, and she was saying, look, I really think there's a case here to say that actually the loss of coral reefs threatens human rights. There was recently the right to a healthy, clean environment that's coming through as an emergent human right through the Human Rights Council. And so it really linked well with that. And there was one case in particular, which was the Billy versus Australia case, where Torres Rights and Australian Indigenous communities took the Australian government to court. They were at the Human Rights Court. They were successful in that petition. And part of it was mentioned about crayfishing and the loss of coral reefs affecting their livelihoods. And so it really set an example that individuals who don't necessarily feel they've got a lot of power to influence change could use a human rights-based approach to take even national governments to court to say that human rights court to say that your failure to act on things like climate change is threatening our future, is threatening our fundamental rights to life. And so there's an example at the moment. There are, I think, 8 or 9 Australian government to court, the Human Rights Court, again, because of failure to act on climate change. And that's currently hasn't been a decision, but that's happening. And I think what I found interesting with the rights-based approach is that it brings together lots of things. And so even if you don't want to try to take a government or somebody to the Human Rights Court, it actually going through these human rights principles about accountability, ensuring that there's equality and there's opportunities for inclusion at every step, are actually things that as scientists we should be doing, particularly when we're looking to undertake science, is that there's actually fundamental principles that we can ensure that we're bringing in to maximize the benefit of science, but also making sure that science is done in the right way. There's been a history of what I would call parachute science, which is Western scientists coming into a site, doing some research, leaving, getting their papers.
Yeah.
Look what I've done, but like, what has the local community got from that research? And did the local community want you to do that research? And
that makes a lot of sense.
Did you engage with them in a way that they understood what you were doing and the implications of that research? And so I see this human rights framework as being something flagging that if we lose coral reefs, like, we risk losing fundamental human rights, but also on a more personal level is that as scientists, we can look at this kind of rights-based approach to how we do our research to try and make sure that we're doing it in a way that is upholding, basic values that feed then into human rights.
Oh, that painted a perfect picture for it. A lot of times when you hear, involve local communities, you don't really know what that means. They don't know how it translates. But how you said it was perfect. It's how is the research helping them? Is it fueling another paycheck for them? I mean, seriously, I think it helps a lot to, for one, kind of be more local to the area too, when you are starting these research papers, because you're going to have naturally just more connections with those people, I think. But from people outside, like people in the US, I mean, it might be a little harder because we're just so isolated out here. It feels like, anyway.
Yeah. But, there's still ways to do it in terms of like you can build those relationships, build those connections, have those consultations. So just those discussions and just not kind of come in, get your data and leave, right? And there's a big push globally, and there's, some amazing American coral scientists that are doing a really great job of not doing science in that way and engaging with communities and ensuring that the data that's collected translates back into benefit. And so again, I think it's this self-check that we should do as scientists to say how are we operating in the most efficient and effective way, lead by example, but then also saying to policymakers and saying to communities that actually you have human rights linked to a healthy, clean and sustainable environment. And if we lose healthy, clean and sustainable environment, there are knock-on effects, not just to the environment, but societal and to your fundamental rights.
Absolutely. And so from there, let's kind of ask you one of our final questions. What is something that you hope people will take away from your work about the future of coral reefs?
So I think for me, it's that we're all connected to the reef, to nature, that we don't have to live next to a reef. We don't even have to visit a coral reef. Like our choices, our actions from the time we get up till the time we go back, like we are inextricably linked to nature, because the threats to the reef are such that if we choose to walk versus drive, recycle versus not recycle, will make a difference to the reef and in turn back to us. But also that realization that the reef is so fundamental to economies, to societies globally, that those 1 billion people that I'd say rely on the reef and who we're helping, they're also helping us. They're helping us by being custodians and champions and advocates to ensure that resource survives. If it doesn't, there'll be knock-on effects to economies, to societies that will impact all of us. And so again, it's that realization we're all connected, we can all be part of the solution. And importantly, that hope isn't lost. Things are bad. Things are challenging. It is a challenging time, to be on the planet, but it's also a really exciting time. There is an opportunity to leave things in a better place. We haven't passed a point of no return. There are healthy, functioning coral reefs still. And so that's what motivates me, because we know that the reef can be resilient. And I think we have to do our part to be resilient and to try and help it get through into the future.
And that's wonderful. I feel hope hearing from people like you in that sense, because the corals aren't dead and people are still actively doing the amazing research on them to help making a huge effect, which is just so inspirational, for new incoming scientists to see that kind of work and say, oh, okay, I can do this. We can do this. Yeah. Well, hey, Dr. Emma Kemp, thank you so much for joining us today. You're out there inspiring people, saving reefs, and I'm wondering where people can find or follow your work, if there is a best place to kind of find this.
No, thank you. So I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram. Emma F. Camp is the easiest way to find me. We also have a Future Reefs account as well, where we post our research updates. And if you put me into Google, you'll probably find my email address. I'm always happy to take any questions that people have. And, thanks for having me. It's been great to connect and to see your passion. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you all so much for tuning into Coral Currents today. Don't forget to follow this on Spotify. We also have the podcast on Apple Music, and on Blue Sky, we have an account under Coral Currents Podcast. Keep updated with the past and future guests there. And yeah, thank you so much. It was really amazing to get to talk to Dr. Emma Camp today. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. Follow along for our next episode with Gavin Miller. We will talk about his part in coral research and education. So we will see you guys on the next one.